Right, so we're going to take a look at some of the basic parts of the brain. We've just talked about the spinal cord, so we'll move our way up now and think about the brainstem, and then we'll take a closer look at the cerebral hemispheres. And what I invite you to do is to kind of shade in these regions with me, so that we can make sure that we can identify them easily. So let's start off by taking our red pen and let's have a look at the midbrain. So identify the midbrain. The midbrain is the top portion of the brainstem. So I'm going to draw a box around the midbrain, something like here. So this is the midbrain, the superior most portion of the brainstem. We can see it clearly on our mid-sagittal section. However, if we move over to the ventral view of the brainstem, it's a little trickier to see because it's kind of hidden in here. But I can just about indicate to you, roughly in this region here, where the midbrain is to be seen. Now, the midbrain, otherwise known as the mesencephalon, meso meaning middle, is a very important part of the brain clinically, and we're going to be looking at it in much more detail in the coming weeks. And it's very important for eye movements and also for reflexes relating to hearing and the visual system. So, for example, reflex orientating movements of the head towards a sound, for example, are mediated at the level of the midbrain. And you know that the midbrain is also involved with eye movements because it contains the oculomotor and the trochlear nerves and their associated motor nuclei. The next region of the brainstem that we need to study sits just caudal to the midbrain, and we're going to colour this in using a blue pen, and this is the pons. So the pons is easily characterised on our median sagittal section by the very distinctive bulge on the anterior surface. Here the pons is much easier to see here, once again because of its prominent bulge, and also thanks to these very distinctive transverse fibres that we can see giving it a kind of striped appearance. Now, the pons gets its name from the Latin for bridge, and the pons contains fibres that cross the midline and connect to the cerebellum. So these fibres that we can see on the ventral view sitting in this transverse orientation are decussating fibres related to the cerebellum. What does the pons do? Well, it's very important for feeding. Remember that it's got this trigeminal nerve connected to it, which supplies the muscles of mastication, and it's also very important for the regulation of sleep. And we're going to do more on sleep later on. Finally, and now we change to our green pen, we're going to take a look at the medulla. Now, the medulla is the caudal-most portion of the brainstem, and it's the part that connects directly to the spinal cord. So here is the medulla here. So I'm just colouring in there, surrounding it with a green circle. Now, the medulla is very, very important for basic homeostatic reflexes. So, for example, you should know within the medulla we've got circuitry that helps regulate blood pressure and blood oxygen and pH. Furthermore, it's got breathing centres within it that regulate our respiratory rate. One additional and important feature of the medulla are these two swellings sitting on the ventral aspect of this region of the brainstem, known as the medullary pyramids. Now, when we do the motor system, we're going to do a lot more on the pyramids, but suffice it to say that these are the major descending motor pathway in humans, and damage to this pathway can result in features like a stroke, for example. And it might interest you to know that each medullary pyramid on each side, each one contains about 1 million axons. So that's the basic parts of the brainstem. Let's move on now to looking at some key features of the cerebral hemispheres. So we're looking now primarily at the folded portion of the cerebral hemisphere. And there are two important terms that we need to define, that being the sulcus and the gyrus. Now a sulcus is essentially a valley, a depression sitting between adjacent gyri. Okay, so here is a gyrus here, and either side of it are two deep sulci. So the sulci are the valleys and the gyri are the raised portions. And the key sulcus that you need to appreciate is the central sulcus. The central sulcus, which we are going to colour in red. And the central sulcus is here. Oops. Here is the central sulcus. Now this is a really important landmark within the brain, because not only does it separate the frontal lobe, which sits anterior to the central sulcus, from the parietal lobe that sits posterior to the central sulcus, it further subdivides the brain into broadly motor regions sitting anteriorly and broadly sensory regions sitting posteriorly. Now this isn't a firm rule, there are exceptions to this, but it is a good rule of thumb that if a structure sits on the anterior side of the central nervous system, if it's anterior to the central sulcus, it's motor, and if it's posterior to the central sulcus, it's sensory. And I remember this as motor forwards. Okay, motor structures are anterior. Now the central sulcus separates two key portions of the brain. Sitting anterior to the central sulcus, we have the precentral gyrus, which I'm going to colour in green. Now the precentral gyrus is a very important motor part of the brain. So this is where we have the cell bodies of upper motor neurons, and damage to these neurons can lead to the features of a stroke. So the precentral gyrus is anterior to the central sulcus and it is motor. In blue, we are going to shade the postcentral gyrus. So here's the postcentral gyrus here, and the postcentral gyrus is an important sensory portion of the brain, and this is where our various sensory modalities end up and are processed. So what you've got is you've got the central sulcus. Let's just change back to a pointer for you. You've got the central sulcus, which is a continuous uninterrupted sulcus from the midline to the lateral sulcus here. Anterior to it, you've got one sausage-shaped region of cortex, which is the precentral gyrus. And posterior to it, you've got another sausage-shaped region of cortex, which is the postcentral gyrus. Now, another important sulcus, which we need to define, is the lateral or sylvian fissure. Whenever we see the word fissure, it just relates to, you know, a pretty big sulcus, really. Don't get too bogged down in the difference between fissure and sulcus. It's not that important. And we're going to indicate the lateral or sylvian fissure in purple. Right, so here is the lateral or the sylvian fissure just here in purple. And you can see that the central sulcus goes all the way down from the midline to the sylvian fissure. And the sylvian fissure separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and the parietal lobes. Next, we're going to look at how the parietal lobe is separated from the occipital lobe. And the parietal lobe is separated from the occipital lobe by the so-called parieto-occipital sulcus, which is not visible on this superficial surface of the brain. It's more easily seen on the mid-sagittal section that we've got on the right-hand side. So here is the parieto-occipital sulcus just here, separating the parietal lobe anteriorly from the occipital lobe posteriorly. Finally, I'm going to indicate one important sulcus of the occipital lobe, and that is the calcarine sulcus, which we're going to indicate in a dark green. And the calcarine sulcus is just about visible here. And we'll learn the importance of the calcarine sulcus in later lectures when we study the visual fields, but suffice it to say at this time that the visual cortex sits very close to this calcarine sulcus. So those are key sulci and gyri of the surface of the brain. Now let's have a look at some of the features on the inferior aspect of the brain, or the ventral aspect of the brain. We're using those two terms pretty much interchangeably. So here's the inferior or ventral surface of the brain, and what we've got on the right hand side is a zoomed in portion just around the structures of the brainstem and the optic chiasm. First of all, we're going to take a look at the optic chiasm, which you should already know a fair bit about because you've studied that in head and neck. And you should recall that the optic chiasm, visible here, is the site at which some of the fibres of the visual system cross the midline. That is, at which they decussate. It's called the chiasm because it looks a bit like the Greek letter chi, which is a big X-shaped letter. Next in green will indicate the uncus. Now the uncus is the medialmost portion of the temporal lobe. Alright, so I'll just indicate it there on the right and here on the left. And if we go to the higher mag view, here's the left uncus and here is the right uncus. Now the uncus is very important clinically because if we have raised intracranial pressure, which maybe is increasing the volume of one of the cerebral hemispheres, it can actually force the uncus downwards, and that can lead to compression of the midbrain by the uncus. This is so-called uncal herniation. Very important. The physiological role of the uncus is in olfaction. Okay, so this is the site of our primary olfactory cortex. Next, let's take a look at the medullary pyramids. We've already seen those in a previous image, but I'll just remind you of the medullary pyramids. These are this important motor pathway running down through the anterior side of the medulla. And we've said before, but it's a fact that I love, that these contain each about 1 million axons, which coincidentally is about the same as the optic nerves. Each optic nerve contains about 1 million axons. So you can see that 1 million axons really doesn't take up all that much space. Finally, we're going to look at a structure which is very important for memory encoding. And this is the parahippocampal gyrus that we'll indicate in orange. So here is the parahippocampal gyrus. There's one on the left, there's one on the right. Okay, and the parahippocampal gyri are very important for the encoding of memory, and these are taking many inputs from all over the brain, and they're acting almost as a kind of point of convergence really. It's here that associations start getting made, and it's here that that encoding of memory starts to happen. So these are some important features of the inferior or ventral aspect of the brain. Now let's take a look at some of the midline structures within the brain, not particularly focusing on gyri and sulci, but also incorporating some of the white matter structures. The first one that we need to look at is the corpus callosum, which you're going to indicate in red. Now this is the corpus callosum here, and the corpus callosum is very, very important because it is a major commissural connection connecting the left and right hemispheres. And here I'll show it you on this MRI as well, just trying to draw it as accurately as I can using my mouse. So it's got fibers connecting the two cerebral hemispheres, and it does contain many millions of fibers, not just a few. It's got lots and lots of fibers. But interestingly, damage to the corpus callosum actually doesn't cause the devastating deficit that you might predict. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail when we look at the functions of the cerebrum. Next, we need to find the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is a really important structure, and I'm just going to indicate it here on the gross anatomical specimen. I'm going to try and indicate it roughly here for you on the MRI scan. The thalamus can be simplistically considered as a relay station, which connects sensory information coming up from the spinal cord with the higher centers in the cerebral cortex. It does a lot more than that. It does a lot of sensory processing, but that's what we can consider it as, is a sensory relay station. Next, let's find a structure called the cingulate gyrus. Now, the cingulate gyrus is very important for memory and emotion, and it sits once again at the midline. All right, so the cingulate gyrus is roughly sitting in this region here, and as we said, it's very, very important for emotional processing and memory, and it is part of the important recurrent loop, which is known as the Papez circuit in emotional processing. You don't need to know a huge amount about the cingulate gyrus in terms of its normal function. However, you do need to appreciate that in certain brain herniation syndromes, it can herniate and compress certain other structures. Next, in light blue, let's find the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus you already know a lot about, because we know that the hypothalamus is important for homeostasis and also acts as a key intermediary between the endocrine and nervous systems. So hypothalamus, very important for you to appreciate its normal structure and function. Next, let's find the fornix, which we're going to look at in this orange colour. Now, the fornix is most easily visualized on the gross anatomical specimen here, but we can appreciate it to a certain extent on the MRI scan. I think it's roughly here, somewhere like that. The fornix is key because it is the major output pathway from the hippocampus. And essentially, this is the way that the hippocampus is able to help to consolidate memories which get laid down in the cerebral cortex. Damage to the fornix can lead to problems with amnesia. Next, in brown, although I'm not sure I've got a brown in my palette of colours, so I'll use the closest thing I have, we need to identify the tectum, which is the dorsalmost portion of the midbrain. So here is the tectum there. It's not brown I've used, it's kind of a dark red. And here's the tectum on the MRI scan there. Now, the tectum contains two important structures, one on each side, those being the superior and inferior colliculi. Colliculus just means little hill, so they're little swellings within the tectum. The superior colliculus is important for visual reflexes, whilst the inferior colliculus is important for auditory reflexes. And the tectum is part of the midbrain, but this is at the back of the midbrain. The final structure which we need to find is the cerebellar tonsil, which we'll use kind of purpley colour. I'll use a purple colour again. I don't have a light purple, but it should be obvious where the cerebellar tonsil is. Here is the cerebellar tonsil here, and on the MRI we can see it just there. Now the key thing to note about the cerebellar tonsil is that it sits alarmingly close to the medulla. And if we have some kind of space occupying lesion up here pushing the brain down, it can push this tonsil down into foramen magnum, which can lead to tonsillar herniation, which can compress the medulla and lead to a life-threatening situation. So really, tonsillar herniation, it's a pre-terminal event really, because compression of the medulla can compromise the cardiovascular and respiratory centres. Now, the structures we've just looked at are not all of the structures that you need to be aware of. You need to know many more. And within the workbook, I've listed these structures here. So this is a list here with little tick boxes for you to find these structures and make sure you're happy with where they are. And what I'd recommend is that you try to identify these structures in as many different contexts as you possibly can. So try and identify them on gross anatomical specimens, images, on your anatomy apps, as many places as you can to get a sound appreciation.